Well, hello. So welcome to the West Midlands and Advanced Manufacturing Competitiveness Challenge session. We have 4 speakers. We start with Frank Van Oor from Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Then we have Professor David Bailey from Aston University, Justin Benson from KPMG. Actually, he is an expert on automotive industry. We end up with Professor Nigel Reynolds from... We are looking forward to that, of course, from Warwick University. So, Frank, 10 minutes. I learned from last week that I have to keep an eye on you on that. Please, Frank, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm presenting some work which I did in this project together with Mark Tisser from the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency and Nicola Cortinovis, also from Erasmus University. And we looked at competitiveness. And what is competitiveness is already quite a question. Like there's a European Regional Competitiveness Index who compares all European regions on all kind of indicators and then see how you perform in these things. But that doesn't really measure competition, because competition is specific for certain industries, and in this region you have a lot of automotive, so you compete with regions which are also specialized in automotive and actually export the same kind of products to the same countries as you do, as your competitors do. So it is about distinguishing competitors, but it's also about coming from exposure, and that's what Phil was talking about, towards competitiveness, and then we actually look at costs and can we make that step? That's the next step in our analysis. So what Phil showed you, don't mind the algebra, is the part on the top. So there's a circle around the UK and it means there's an exposure analysis. But we now look at what would be the production cost analysis, because that's more important for competition and for competitiveness. Which regions are actually hit by higher costs if we have this hard Brexit as it was suggested. And we get this picture. It's a bit different than the picture you showed before. It's not only regions which are very industrialized, it's also regions that have a lot of agriculture. And it has regions which have agriculture and industrial specializations. So now we make a step from exposure to impact, and then we have to take account about substitution and other things. You have to calculate these issues. And then this might be ranging from inner London in 0.5% extra costs to more than 1.3% in the Highlands. And again, the question might be, is it much or not? And of course, these are regional aggregates, and they differ again by industry. For automotives, it's 4%. So in this region where you're specialized in these kind of aspects, you might have much more cost increase compared to your competitors else in Europe. This was the European picture. Well, it's not, well, it should be a bit clearer. And then you again see that in the UK, higher cost increase are occurring with our scenarios. We use the same scenarios as the London School of Economics, but also countries in Belgium and the Czech Republic who are also specialized in those things which are really into those value chain operations. So this says something about competitiveness. If your costs rise 2 to 4% in your region in certain industries compared to the ones in Germany, which are also in automotive, and they only have 0.5% cost increase, that's a huge difference. That will change market shares, and that will change impacts on who is surviving. We can look at many different industries. You can see here, for instance, in forestry, lodging, mining and fishing, it's about 4%. And we can also look at several regions. There are about 360 regions in Europe, and if you take out the West Midlands, you can see here what are the impacts on these industries if we do this exercise. So why do we want to know this? We want to know what is the competitiveness challenge. If you have an exposure of 10 to 15%, and if you have a cost increase of about 2%, but that can be differing on different industries, arguably more in the agriculture and industrial region, what kind of focused policies do you need then? Because you will know you will lose competitive power for sure. So can productivity be impacted locally more than this 2%, outperforming competitive advantages of other regions? Because we talked about what is the strategy in Birmingham. They also have Stuttgart strategies, and there are Munich strategies, and there are strategies in Eindhoven on how to be competitive and how to get market share. Actually, all those 360 regions in Europe, they have competitive strategies, and they're all working on the same kind of issues. So which other regions actually, and this time I take the case of the West Midlands, where are you actually competing with? So we looked at which other regions export the same kind of products as the West Midlands do to the same kind of countries. So the West Midlands export cars or cars components to Germany, but so does Düsseldorf, Luxembourg, Stuttgart, Munich. They export the same kind of products. So they are real competitors for you in the sense that they are operating on the same markets. We can also see who's actually winning market share from you in the last 10 years, 15 years. Our data are a bit dated, so they are minus 4 years, 3 years. But still, these regions win market share in the locations you actually are competing in Europe. And it is differing over different kind of industries. In knowledge-intensive business services, the most important competitor is London. And in modern production and materials, which is automotive, it's Stuttgart, Munich, but it's also Tübingen, Budapest, and Turingen. So those are real competitors of you. Competing on what? What can you do as a region or a city to be competitive? Well, you want to be competitive on productivity. Actually, total factor productivity is what we try to measure. And these things are influenced by agglomeration, influenced by connectivity, knowledge infrastructure. This was mentioned before the break also. It's an important issue in this region to have a lot of R&D and a lot of skilled people who can work on this. You need good labor markets, you need a good housing environment, you need amenities. All these things are known from the literature to impact on regional performance of industries. And actually we can measure them for all those 360 regions in Europe for the last 10 to 15 years. And what turns out, what is most important for this region, what is there to be prioritized, it's actually this knowledge infrastructure, which was mentioned before. It's the labor market, the matching of high-skilled needs, and the structural change opportunities. How can you evolve into new markets, given the fact that you are specialized in certain things and good in it? So what things are related to what you do? You don't have them yet, but you can actually move into. And those things are quite crucial. And if I look at these aspects for this region, it's a new eye test, but we have a lot of diagnostic here. You see a lot of indicators. Here you see the competitors I showed you before. Just remember, if you're red, you score less than your regions which actually take market share from you, who are competing from you. If you score green, you score better. So the ones on R&D and patenting, Stuttgart, Munich, Eindhoven, perform much better on that indicator than you do in this region. So if you want to make a difference, even want to make up for the 2% you're going to lose out in this Brexit, that might be quite a job. Of course, this job has always been here because this is a process that's been going on for years. But at least we can now pinpoint out which kinds of indicators are crucial for which kind of regions. Because in this time I looked at East Midlands, but I can also look at Dublin, I can look at Eindhoven. And that's why we made a large website in which you can click on a region, you can click on an industry, and then you get all these kind of information. Well, at least you get the data. Information and data is a different thing, so you need to interpret it. The next step we want to show is, if it's about competitiveness, that not all growth is good for competitiveness. Suppose you are exporting from a region I, this region, Birmingham, to a German market, and you have about 25% of the market there. So your market share is 25%. Still readable. Then the market in Germany grows. So the pie gets bigger. You still have the 25%, the same piece of the pie is for you, but you have growth, which is demand-led. So the demand gets bigger, so you have to produce more to get these demands actually there. What is really competitive is if you have structural growth, if you can get a larger piece of the pie. And what we see now, if we look at all the industries for this region, we see that most of the industries are actually getting less of the pie in markets which are, after the crisis, growing again. So we see a lot of demand coming, but what we're really interested in is that you actually get smaller pieces of the pie, and meaning you get less and less competitive. You can see this on the website also. So we call this good growth, bad growth. Most of the industries in this region are actually in this quadrant, meaning that you have a lot of growth because there's much more demand for the products. But you don't actually grow because you get a larger market share in the markets you're working on. The markets on automotive, the markets on insurances, the market on all the other things you're working in. And this is what we sometimes call masked losers. You don't seem to be losing because you're growing. But actually you're losing out because other regions might be growing and at the same time getting more market share. So this is important to look at. So the urgency of local policy responses to the West Midlands, in this case, and of course we can do this for all regions in Europe, is, well, there's a large exposure to Brexit, which was mentioned by Professor McCann. There might also be an asymmetrical cost increase compared to the regions you really compete with in Europe. And I showed Europe, but on the website you will see it's also China, although it's a Newcastle dot on the map, but it's still competing. It's also the US, so you can also see who other countries and regions outside Europe are competing with you. Competitiveness impacts of crucial factors like the labor market or R&D, they are much better performing in regions like Munich, Eindhoven, and Stockholm, which are also specialized in the same kind of industries you try to be specialized in. So this is a further issue. The crucial factors actually depend on a complex variety of stakeholders. If you want higher educated people, you have to be with universities. But also people who actually do work in manufacturing, they don't need university education, they need education on the job. And so you need firms. Firms, universities, governments, and we are talking all the way from governments. They have to do something, but it's the university and firms who actually can provide the most crucial factors you need. So you have to work together, and that's complex in the sense that you have a lot of different stakeholders having different stakes. Time is needed for materializing structural change. The lady before the break said there are cycles. Cycles might be 8 to 10 years old. Nowadays, we tend to think cycles get shorter, because if you today invent an app, tomorrow it will be online. So that's a very short cycle. But if you look at the most important industries like automotive, sustainable energy and those kind of things we are looking at, they really need a lot of time to get implemented. There are things at stake. There are firms like Shell who actually invested largely in other business systems, so they have to turn over. And of course they will turn over in the end, but it takes a lot of time. Time is needed. This region has much demand-led growth. You can see that, I can show you in the break in the website. Yes, because it's 1 minute. So the pie gets larger, and this region profits because it actually supplies to Germany and other regions which get larger, but you have less structural growth. You get smaller pieces of the pies, and that's worrisome. But that has been worrisome all the time. It's only now magnified because you look at Brexit, and it's multiplied because of Brexit. Well, I didn't show you anything on FDI and knowledge. You can also look at competition there. Cities like Munich, London, Paris, they attract huge amounts of FDI if you compare it to Birmingham. Some of the networks you might be good in, but most of the networks that leads to most growth actually are not so good. Knowledge networks might be who is cooperating with who on R&D, who is cooperating on who in attracting talent. And those other 359 regions in Europe are not doing nothing. So they all have competitive strategies and they're all investing in crucial issues. So I want to end here. Maybe afterwards I can show this website. It is, well, as it says here, bilingual. So it was actually originally designed in Dutch. And we are now on 80% in translating it. One of the outputs of this project will be this website in which you can see all these issues yourself on a lot of different indicators for a lot of different regions. But I think some of the messages here should be taken quite serious, and that's where I think should end this presentation.
Thank you very much, Frank. So now we move to Professor David Bailey. David Bailey, many of you know him, of course. He is a professor on industrial policy at Aston University. And even if he normally talks about automotive, I think today he is going to talk about a bit broader.
Yeah.
Please, David.
Thank you very much. I was going to talk about automotive, then I saw that Justin was on the panel who knows far more about it than I do, and Nigel talking about FDI, so I thought, oh bugger, what am I going to talk about? So I thought I would talk about the fourth industrial revolution, which Nikki spoke about earlier, and what that means for advanced manufacturing, particularly in this region. I'll come back to Brexit at the end because that raises a whole set of industrial policy implications, which I would argue overlaps with the sort of policy response we need in terms of Brexit. So I'll very quickly talk about what's called Industry 4.0, how we need to go beyond that, Brexit, a little bit on auto, but I won't overlap too much with Justin, and sort of policy issues. It's argued that we are entering a fourth industrial revolution. So there are these ideas that we've got these Kondratiev long waves stimulated by whole clusters of significant innovation which change the economy and lead to new waves of growth. I don't want an argument about how many waves we've had, which is what always happens when I put up this diagram, but the argument is we're entering a new wave of economic growth linked to a whole set of new technologies. Those are the linking up of 3D printing, AI, robotics, sensoring, space technology, drones, green and renewables, all sorts of technologies that are linking together to transform modern manufacturing. So a lot of discussion and research on the third or fourth industrial revolution which we're going into. Now, in terms of the European definitions of what's called Industry 4.0, it's about these kind of the cyber-physical side of it. AI, the Internet of Things, which Nikki referred to, about how factories can be connected together, the use of big data. So this comes back to the idea of smart and flexible factories, factories of the future, about how there can be mass customization in markets, but it's very much about the sort of technology side of it. Our argument in the Makers project, which is a European-funded RISE project, is that actually we need to think much broader in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, what it means for industry, but also society more broadly. So yes, we've got all those new technologies that are coming. Which I can't use properly, all those new technologies that are coming in terms of things like the Internet of Things and AI, but we've also got completely new markets. So as we'll see in a moment, in terms of the transition that will take place in terms of the auto industry, where at the moment car makers make a car and hope to sell it to you, that will fundamentally change. So in the future, car makers will have to shift into providing a mobility service. You know, down the line, 10, 15 years down the line, we will be summoning driverless taxis on our smartphones. The issue then is where do car makers position themselves in that new value chain that's going to be created. So whole new markets will be devised. We're likely to see as well much more in the way of personalised and flexible customization. Already, you can go on the web, design a piece of jewellery yourself or with a designer, and a jeweller in the jewellery quarter, one of the original Marshall's industrial districts not far from here, will print it out for you using 3D technology. He'll probably, or she will probably print out two, so you can keep one in the safe. You don't need an insurance policy then, by the way, so insurance industry will lose out, but you'll be able to co-design and co-create products that are made specifically for you, so they are customised. We're going to see whole new business models. A lot of companies will have to shift into providing a service alongside the manufactured product. We know that Rolls-Royce do that already with power by the hour. Car companies increasingly will have to do it as well. Sustainability will be sort of writ large through this, and think about 3D printing. Traditional manufacturing techniques take a lump of metal, knock bits off it down to a small component. This is the other way around. So you can really build in sustainability into the process. Big implications for supply chains. If you think that the first time you print that component out, the cost of doing it is the same time as the millionth time, then economies of scale may not be so significant. We may see the rebirth of small-scale manufacturing, which could significantly alter what economies of scale mean in the car industry. I was talking to a company not far from here, which makes composite materials that go into cars. They were talking about maybe economies of scale being in the tens of thousands for cars rather than the hundreds of thousands. So significant implications. That could mean then new production spaces, both in terms of how factories are organised and how clusters are organised as well. So very significant changes coming in the industry. In automotive, for example, there's a lot of discussion. Some of this is from KPMG, so I've copied it from you, Justin. Things like connected devices, AI, predictive analytics, flexible systems of production, connected factories. So that kind of engineering side of the change that's coming. But we're also seeing a whole load of new technologies. So think about electric cars that are coming. I drove here in one today. A shift towards car sharing in some big cities, much more in the use of lightweight materials, connected cars. The car that I drove in is connected to the internet all the time. I can control various functions from it. One of the cars we've got, you can even summon it to come and get you if it's not too far away. So all sorts of interesting technologies coming. Digitization, big data, autonomous driving, much more in the way of collaboration across firms to try and make that happen. Now, why is Brexit relevant for that? Well, that requires significant investment. And if we are not seeing the investment in the same scale in the UK car industry that we saw before, which Nikki alluded to, and I don't think the full effects of that have come through yet, we could lose investment in those new technologies and therefore affect the competitiveness of the industry going forward. This is not a very good diagram to see, but it shows how the traditional value chain in the car industry, suppliers, assemblers, which was very vertical, is shifting to all sorts of different sectors linking together, whether it's 3D printing of components. There's even a crazy car company in America called Local Motors where you design the car, they print it out for you. Looks a bit like something out of Wacky Races, but that's the sort of technologies that are coming. Electric car charging, new energy sources, fleet management firms like Uber, which really manage the fleet of cars that are available. Think when that shifts into driverless cars, you will summon a driverless Uber, as well as GPS and positioning satellites and all sorts of other technologies, a whole new value chain. So, some of the key issues out of this revolution. One is co-creation, consumers creating things or designing things with the manufacturer, new ways of consuming or accessing services and products, a servitization that will take place. Manufacturing is still important, but offered as part of a service. A fundamental change in some industries in terms of economies of scale. I think there is the possibility of shorter value chains for the reasons I'm talking about, but also because demand is changing as well. So increasingly, we want a personalized product and we want it delivering quickly. So that may mean quite short value chains in some industries. You already see it in fashion. So the Zara effect, whereby Zara source garments from Europe and North Africa because it is quicker to get to market. They don't want something on a ship from China for 6 weeks because it may be out of fashion. Those sorts of arguments. And also rethinking of products and processes from an ecological perspective. A lot of kind of resistance to this, awareness, resistance to change, uncertainty about how quickly this will move. There is a delusion, I think, about the inevitable supremacy of services. We are seeing a rebirth of modern manufacturing, I think. And implications for policy. So just a quick flavour, I'd argue that we need a very kind of clear commitment from the government over the direction of change. We haven't seen that in the car industry recently, for example. Huge confusion for consumers. We need to think about promoting technology adoption and application. So we've got to think about policy that joins technology with sectors with place. So we join up industrial policy in a holistic way. That raises very much the role of regional industrial policy, which is exactly the same response we need to be thinking about in terms of Brexit. We need to be thinking much more about skills. It will mean a lot of change in terms of the skills mix that people will need going forward, not only now, but throughout people's lives. Now, some countries are great at that. Singapore, Scandinavia. We're rubbish at it. We did a great job on dealing with, say, MG Rover, but we don't keep doing it. We need this commitment to lifelong retraining and skills. Big investment in infrastructure required, supporting firms to access the technologies that are coming, developing platform sharing so that the technologies can be applied across different sectors so that they become general purpose technologies. The EU, for example, is encouraging digital innovation hubs. Are we going to do that when we leave? What are we going to do? All these sorts of questions. What can we do in terms of the global value chain, repositioning it, attracting new elements of it? A lot of the literature I've been looking at recently is about what's called the transitions literature, where you break out of a lock-in of an existing technology and that new technology emerges in niches. What that literature often doesn't get is that they are often emerging in certain places, often supported by local governments. So we've got to put place very central into all of this. Now, coming back to Brexit, I'd argue that actually we've got this huge uncertainty affecting investment and confidence and the willingness of manufacturers to invest, which in terms is relevant for these big changes that are coming. I would argue that actually we should be prioritising, as the House of Lords rightly has laid out this week, prioritising access to the single market in order to minimise the transaction costs for manufacturing. We've got to look at issues around skills and access to skills. And there are some opportunities around reshoring, which was touched on earlier in terms of our supply chain. But if we're going to do that, we've got to really go for it. It's got to be a clear part of policy. So how do we change the tax system to encourage manufacturers to invest in plant and equipment through things like capital allowances? How do we support our exporters better? How do we attract parts of the supply chain that we want? And again, this ultimately comes back to having much more in the way of devolution and a local and regional industrial policy, which actually is the place at which we can possibly try and deliver some of this. On that note, I'll finish. Thank you. Bit of a ramble, but thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. So now we move to the private sector. So this is Justin Benson, the head of Automotive for KPMG in the UK. And also he's leading the firm's Brexit response in the industrial manufacturing sector. So please, Justin, the floor is yours.
So I'm going to focus very much on automotive. I know it's been used as a lot of examples, but there's a lot to think about. And one of the things I talk about a bit is actually how important the automotive industry is to the nation as a whole. And here are some of the numbers. And it's great. It's a really great news story. It's 4% of GDP, big business, 70 billion. There's over nearly 2,500 companies in the UK auto sector. It's actually probably 17 or more actually NSCs, but the real ones of note are 15 NSCs, national sales companies, so people who sell cars in the UK, and 8 of them manufacture in the UK. All of them are owned by companies overseas, which is really important. We're a big inward investor marketplace, and 8 out of the 10 F1 teams are based in the UK. So the technology, the research and development, the ability to make new products and develop new cars is incredibly mature in the UK. So it's great, isn't it? Okay. So what's the problem? Auto investment. I think this might have been mentioned earlier. I'm sorry I wasn't here, but this is the big issue for me. It's okay now, and nothing's changed as of now. And we're all trading really well, and we have about 80% of everything we make in auto goes overseas, which is fantastic, and that's actually protected us quite a bit from the recent downturn in the UK in car sales. But we're well known, we really punch above our weight in the auto sector in the UK. And that's worrying, because I'll come back to that in a moment. Oh, hang on. What that means, sorry, is if you think about new models, or new ways of doing things, and particularly new models, is our automotive industry going to continue to invest in new models going forward? So you've got, classic, JLR in Slovakia, you've got Ford, are all based around Europe. They make engines in the UK. Toyota make cars here, Nissan make cars here. Do I continue to make the vehicle here? I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. This was interesting, I thought, to help try and look at it from the two sides of the coin. So the majority of the 1.7 million cars produced in the UK contain parts from German suppliers. That's important, obviously, to generate the fact that the goods are moving across the border. And 44% of the vehicles fitted with German parts then go out of the UK to other countries. We're a real manufacturing hub. German suppliers located in the UK, so 2.7 billion, and it's the largest exporter of car parts to the UK at 4.6 billion. I know it's probably, you've heard this before, but if you look at the Bavaria region rather than Germany as a whole, Bavaria, so BMW, Daimler, for example, the UK is the second largest market to Bavaria after the United States. It's a hugely important market for the premium car makers. Right, but there's just one point I'd like to make outside Brexit is because Brexit isn't the only problem, in a sense, for auto manufacturers. David alluded to it just a moment ago. We see 3 key disruptors. So if you think Brexit as one, the other 3 are electric vehicles and alternative fuel vehicles, etc. Mobility as a service, and connected and autonomous vehicles. I cannot overestimate the impact that autonomous vehicles will have on our lives and on the industry. It is, you cannot overestimate it. It is going to be huge. The next 10 years of change, driven by mobility and the changes up there, will be more so than you've seen in the last 60 years. Yeah? So it's quite remarkable, some of this. And David alluded to the IoT aspects. These are all really important points. So just look at it from a Brexit perspective. So the two key areas for me is model investment and supply chain. So you're going to, our car's going to get made here in the first instance, and then from a supply chain perspective, can we actually deliver the components and make it work? To give you a flavour for that, this is a very high-level view of the new model investment decisions. And if you think about, so we're going to go 2019, 2020, that line may move a bit, but at the moment we're very much still in sort of April 2019. But there's going to be a lot of decisions made post-2019. And a number of those decisions need to be made now. And someone else mentioned earlier about the 7-year or 7-year plus product life of these vehicles. We've had some announcements over the last couple of years, but nothing recently. And that, and my view is that's very much by design. They're waiting to see what's going to happen with the EU trade deal before they're going to commit large numbers into the UK market. And it's not really whether we're in or out of Brexit, to be honest. It's they just want to know what the playing field is. If we know what the playing field is, we can make a decision. Jump that. So this is the 7-year itch. Now this is the 7-year development of a vehicle, very broadly. But if you think of it in terms of looking at your forecasts and looking at how many cars you're going to sell, but they do this outside of the UK. So this is happening in Germany or Japan or the US, and then they're saying, UK, you've got to bid to make this vehicle. So you'll have seen a lot about the Nissan Qashqai recently, for example. They've bid for that in the global market, and they then get the investment, and then they make the vehicle. If it becomes cost uncompetitive to make the vehicle here, then they'll move it, because they're looking at a global market. I'm not saying they will. I have no insight into what they are going to do. I'm just giving you some of the issues and thoughts about what will be going, or what is going through their minds. This is a more closer to home example. You'd be aware of all of this, but something like 85% of the vehicles that Jaguar Land Rover make are made in the UK. So they're very much an export market. 80% of their vehicles are exported, and something like 30-odd% of that, 85%, goes to European Union. So you have to start thinking about what that means, but a lot of the products they bring in to make their vehicles comes from Eastern Europe, for example. And again, just to illustrate, they're a global company, and they're making cars in China now, in Brazil, and very soon in Slovakia. So again, they'll be making choices about where they make new models as well. So from a supply chain risk perspective, which is the way that we look at it, we think there are 4 key areas that need to be thought about. So you've got customs. I'll give you an example of this in a moment. So if you think of the WTO rules, which is the basic, is what we sort of describe as the worst case scenario. So it's thinking about that, or thinking about what different scenarios might be not as worse as that, if you like. And then network optimization, the warehousing, logistics, the manufacturing locations I've touched on already, but these are all things that you start to think about if your supply chain is going to change. And if you go back to the point that my supply chain is not only changing potentially because of Brexit, but it's already changing because of electric vehicles, then all that 25 years of investment in diesel and petrol is starting to wane away fast, and I've got to invest in electric vehicles as well. So the strain on the balance sheets becomes even higher. And if you really want to make an electric vehicle, the best place to make it is China, because they have all the technology and they have all the batteries and lots of other things. Or you'd at least consider China as a place to make it. I'm not advising you to do that. I'm not advising auto companies to do it. But you need to think in terms of the globe, when you're thinking about making a car. Distressed supply chain, probably speaks for itself, but it's been alluded to already. We see a number of if you've got a supplier, for example, that's quite leveraged, has got a lot of debt on its balance sheet, and it's making a little bit of extra money that is investing a bit in the business in the future. If that little bit of profit disappears and all of a sudden they're finding it difficult to pay off the interest on the debt, then it becomes difficult to operate. And so ergo, suppliers could be straining in some areas if they're not getting product. I mean, we actually work with the OEMs, and we have some standard agreements where they will call us if they see a problem with one of their suppliers. There's lots of early warning signs, and I'd say 9 times out of 10 we turn things around. We help the OEM to get the supplier relationship right, and we help the supplier a lot to get things right for them for the longer term. But we see there could be a lot more of that going on. And then cash and working capital. I'll come back to that, but that's basically have I got the same amount of cash post Brexit that I have now, and there are reasons why you won't. So this is that's supposed to be a picture of the United Kingdom. The big bubbles at the top bottom right hand corner there are the goods moving around the Channel Tunnel and the Dover. On average, through Channel Tunnel and Dover, a lorry goes through those two ports every 2 minutes. We reckon if that doubles to 4 minutes, so just 4 minutes for a lorry to get through, you'll have a queue about 20 kilometres up the M20. So it's really, now, will that last for weeks, months, years? Probably not. How do you manage it? But thinking about that delay and how you do it, and I'll explain why that's very important. This is our view of what we think is going to happen. You're going to get an extra. So you see, at the moment, you're not really talking about exports. When you're sending goods to the European Union, they're not really exports. We call them exports because they're going out of the UK. But post-Brexit, they become exports. So you'll have a lot more people actually become exporters by definition. And then, because at the moment, from a tax and from a trading perspective, they're not really exporters, but they will become exporters. Hence, it's going to be a lot more. So you think about the declarations that will have to increase. We believe it's about 4 billion admin costs. That is a little bit of a finger in it. Sorry? Yes. Yeah. Because you're talking, it's all the extra. Well, it's the extra staff, and to cope with the extra. Yeah. So if I was living in Kent and I had some spare cash, I'd probably invest in car parks, recruitment agencies, and hotels. But that's just me. I'm being slightly. I don't mean to be facetious, but it's an important point, and these are things that we want government to be thinking about. They are to a degree, but they keep coming up with answers which have credence, but they lack detail. And this is partly because we still don't know what the European Union trade agreement is going to be. So this is a case study. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned WTO rules. This is the hit on this particular company, 66 million. Their customs costs would increase by 66 million. And that's per month. That's something else. So that was one example. This is another example. This is a company that manufactures mostly overseas. It does have some manufacturing facilities in the UK, but most of it's done in Germany and other parts of the European Union. And they export a huge number of finished product into the UK. Now, one of their issues, and it will be for a lot of them, is tax. Okay, customs tax, but VAT. So going back to the cash flow point, if you've got to pay your VAT at the point of exit, number one, will you get it paid back, if you can claim it back? And number two, if you can, how long does it take you to get paid? At the moment, it's a mathematical exercise. One just cuts out the other. In this case, you're talking about 20% of whatever it is that you're sending over, and you're talking about billions of pounds. Do I get it paid back? But even if I don't, that's 4 months probably without cash that I have now. So it's important to think about those cash implications as well. These are real world examples, and hopefully I've taken this down to a level of detail that's hitting home a little bit. I'll come back. That's sort of final slide. Just before I go on to, I'll just do the. This is a famous slide of GKN. it's basically showing GKN make drive shafts, amongst other things, but the product is made and finished and turned and all sorts of different things done in different countries. They're done in different countries and then come together in the UK, or in some cases, and I think in the case of the Mini, the product goes across the border 10 times because it has a process in the UK, then it goes to Germany for finishing, comes back to the UK, and so on. And then finally, when it ends, you always have to remember that when it goes into the car then gets exported probably back to Germany. So it's a very integrated supply chain. Really important to understand that. So I'll just finish off, because I thought the question about will Brexit actually happen is worth just my view on that very, very quickly. If there was another referendum, I have no insight, I'm afraid, but if there was another referendum, I'd probably vote to stay out, because I believe in the democratic process, and I think that's really important from our perspective. There's a real need now to actually deal with this. But there's a big difference between the way the UK look at Brexit and the way the rest of Europe looks at it. Up until February this year, all my colleagues in Europe were basically calling us all sorts of names and thought we were idiots. And they said, the second thing they said was, it ain't going to happen. And we said, well, it is. We've been convincing boards based in Europe for the last 12 months that Brexit will happen. And it will. I mean, the point made earlier about what kind of Brexit will it be. If you then take that as so the Europeans have then, what changed about 6 months ago was the transition agreement. Bizarrely, we sort of all went, oh, transition agreement, thank goodness for that. The Germans in particular looked at it and went, bloody hell, they're actually going to do it. And that's the important thing. And that's what we have to get our head round, because we've got all these problems to solve. And they're not insolvable. And there's lots of opportunity there. All the new technologies, all the opportunities to build new businesses and build new ideas into the way that you do things are all there. We just need to be working on them now. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Justin. So now, last but not least, Professor Nigel Reynolds. He's a professor of international business at Warwick Business School, and he's going to talk about FDI.
Yeah, when I realised I was on 8th, I thought, well, I'll do some slides, but everything's going to be said. So then I thought what I'll do is I'll talk about a piece of work I'd done for either Nikki. Then I saw Nikki was on the programme, so I'm stuffed. I am going to talk largely about FDI. It might even have some vague relevance to what's behind me on the slides. I'm going to pick up actually first on where Justin finished. I have done, I counted up, a talk, basically the same talk, 28 times over the last year, 2 years, on why inward investment is going to fall post-Brexit. Okay? I am not going to do that today. If you really want to see it, it's even on YouTube. Someone recorded it for posterity. I'm not particularly even interested in debating why it's going to fall. It just is. You've heard it all today. What was, however, interesting is the last time I did that talk was to a collection of parliamentarians. There's this body academics will be familiar with called the Industry Parliamentary Trust, that they get collections of parliamentarians together. It's quite interesting, you know, you've got like arch remainers like Lord Hannay and Lord Tebbit and Sammy Wilson all in the same room talking to them about Brexit. It's quite an interesting proposal. And I kind of said, okay, we all know foreign investment's going to fall. This is what I think we can do about it. And one particular parliamentarian went, what? And I said, well, it's kind of generally accepted for all the reasons you've heard in the last 2 hours, inward investment is going to fall post-Brexit. And this is somebody who earns their living by being voted for. Went, nobody told us this. What do you mean nobody told you this? Where have you been, you've been living in a cave for the last 3 years. And it was interesting that the debate or the discussion that I was really meant to facilitate stopped being about what I wanted to talk about, which is what the hell are we going to do about it now, kind of picking up from where you left off. And they just rehearsed all of the crap that we've been talking about for the last 2 years in terms of yes, it will, no, it won't, why, whatever. And I found that really depressing, if I'm honest, that was the state of, if you like, I mean, this is they're not necessarily a cross-section of parliamentarians, they're people who can be bothered to come along and listen. But I found that really quite depressing. So, on that note, what can we do about this now? Well, there are essentially 2 reasons why we as an economy or as a society get terribly interested in foreign investment, okay? So the reason, I'm going to put words in Nikki's mouth slightly, but the main reason why the growth company are interested in foreign investment is jobs. Yeah, it's creating employment, okay? More generally, the reason that national policymakers get terribly interested in foreign investment is either because it's a short-term solution to a sort of balance of payments problem, or alternatively because it's going to bring in new technology and it's linked to innovation and whatever. So my sort of mantra, and anyone who's had the misfortune to read anything I've written over the last kind of 20 years, is really about understanding what it is you're going to get. Okay, so if you are seeking to generate foreign investment in particular activities, particular sectors, whatever it is, then understand what it is you want, understand what it is you want out of it, which is essentially the piece of work I did with Nikki, kind of trying to help put that in a local context. So, there's a horrible slide. But essentially what that is if you look at the sort of vertical index, that is just basically the share of GVA of a sector in the local economy, and the horizontal index is its average growth rate, and the size of the bubble is the amount of inward investment that sector has attracted. So you can immediately see why we've all been talking about the automotive sector for the last 2 hours, because there it is over there. No, this doesn't work. Oh, excuse me. There it is over there on the right. Sorry, I'm dyslexic, things like that are a challenge. There it is over there, but you can see all of the others. And then another one that kind of sticks out is food products, etc. You know, big bubble, but in a very different place in the diagram in terms of... Unpopular, aren't I? A very different place in the diagram in terms of the growth rates and so on and so on. So it's about, okay, it's about understanding what it is we're going to do. Now, why would Nikki like to chase inward investment in something like food? Well, that's jobs. Yeah, that's the sort of sector that's quite labour intensive. It's the sort of sector that will generate jobs for people who are already here and are essentially kind of underemployed or unemployed or looking to trade up from a sort of minimum wage job into something slightly better. Why would you be interested in something like arts and entertainment? Well, that's a whole different sector. You know, there's been lots of discussion today, by the way, on Birmingham as the region. I just feel the need to point out, as I live in Coventry, the West Midlands is not just Birmingham. You know, Coventry is the city of culture. Yay, you know, we all know that. But, you know, so there are other sorts of sectors where you chase inward investment for different reasons. Okay? So, what we kind of did, and this is a sort of quick run through, is basically trying to match up where you've got sectors which generate lots of jobs, which is essentially generating jobs for people who are here, compared with sectors which might bring in new technology, but most of those sectors, as anyone and sat here at the front, anyone who works locally will tell you, a lot of the high-tech sectors are already facing huge skill shortages. Okay, so it's all well and good thinking, right, well, we're going to go for loads of sort of inward investment in something like, there we go, in something like computer electronics, whatever, all sounds great, new technology coming in. Those sectors, as it stands, cannot find people to come and work for them with the right skills. So they need some form of immigration, even if it's within UK immigration. Sorry, I teach MBAs, I'm used to waving my hands around. and then you've sort of got this tension essentially. And so what that is that's then a sort of an attempt to put these things together, that you can think about certain sectors that will generate productivity growth, you can think about certain sectors that will generate employment growth, and then the colour of the coding really is where they sit in terms of skill shortages that already exist. Okay, now why we focus on advanced manufacturing? Well, advanced manufacturing is almost seen as the sweet spot between those two things, that it brings in new technology, but it also employs large numbers of people, so that all sounds great. But talk to anybody who works in HR in automotive round here, and they'll already tell you when they expand, they hire from their supply chain. I just leave that there. Okay, so that's kind of where we are in terms of bringing all this together. That brings me back on then to the labour market. There's been an awful lot of talk today so far about competitiveness and about capital. What about people? Yeah. An awful lot of firms in the labour-intensive sector have got used to solving their skills problems with immigration. Bringing people from different parts of Europe, whatever. We've basically made that harder. To quote a company I was talking to not very long ago, they said, "It turns out that our Eastern European workers are not all that happy we voted out." It turns out. Yeah? So we've heard a lot about how difficult it is to move capital and to move goods around. We've also made it harder in terms of employing people. You know, I'm not telling tales out of school here, but companies will now tell you they cannot get visas for non-EU workers at the moment because the NHS is taking them all. Okay? And yet we also hear that, you know, we can't employ Indian doctors because there aren't enough visas. Okay? I'm not knocking the NHS, but the government is basically taking all the visas that the firms would like to use to bring in skilled people to fill all of those gaps. Okay? And that is where we are with the current insanity of the moment. Okay, so, very briefly, I'm probably out of time. What can we do about all of this? This builds from the previous two speakers. As somebody before, don't know whether it was you, somebody talked about devolution. Devolution is the solution to this. You know, devolution, the one solution. You know, I am sold on this. I was really skeptical about devolution, but actually, if we're going to do this, we need to understand what the blockages are locally. Is it skills? Is it transport? Is it access to finance? Is it innovation? Is it we need more higher skills in terms of commercialisation? What is it? That is a local problem. We cannot think of that as a national problem that the government is going to fix for us. That has to be devolved to the local economy, and that has to be fixed in partnership between, to be blunt, people like Andy Street and also LEPS, CBI, so on and so on. We have to fix that together. We have to fix what activities, I'm not necessarily going to say sectors, but what activities we are going to be good at. Let's build on what the analysis that Frank's done in terms of where we sit, where we are competitive now, what can we do about this, and how can the region then develop that. This has to be done at a local level. Firms then, if they want accountability for this, whether it's spending the apprenticeship levy, whatever it is, if firms are going to be made accountable, then this has to be solved near them. Firms have to have a voice. And if it's vertical policy from Whitehall, it's not going to happen even when the whole of Whitehall has stopped worrying about Brexit. Okay, and that's it from me.
Well, thank you very much. I'm the worst timekeeper ever. But I think I'm going to allow for 2 questions. So anyone has a question?
Hello, my name is Jane Trowbridge. I work as an information assistant at the University of Birmingham Library. I've sat and listened to all of this. I've done nothing but to 2 years but look at how bad the impact of Brexit is going to be on this country. I just really like to know why the business community aren't standing up and saying more loudly that this is a bad idea. And I know that you've said, oh, it's the democratic process, but there's so much evidence that the EU referendum was really deeply flawed. And today, the Electoral Commission have fined Leave EU for overspending and for breaking the rules on campaigning. So there's so much information that what was sold to the people was not what they're going to get. I don't understand why the business community aren't standing up and saying, we really need to look at this again. Because it's just madness. I mean, I'm really pleased that people are more interested in the process of running this country and about where the power lies and where the investment has failed so much of our country. But it's brilliant that people want change, but this is the worst change possible. So why aren't people, because you just need people to stand up and say, this is a really bad idea.
Yeah, there's a bit of historic reason for that. If you go back to just before the referendum, businesses were encouraged to communicate with their workforces, which they did, most of them did, and were doing it in a positive way. So if I give you probably the worst example, there's a US company based here, but with the European head office is in Germany, and the fact it's German has nothing to do with it at all, really. It's just that it's a European base. But the European chief executive wrote to all the employees in the UK saying the reasons why they should be voting to remain, yeah? Which he did, and then obviously we voted out. But he then wrote, immediately after the referendum, he wrote a note to everybody in the UK saying how disappointed he was. Now that's sort of the worst example. But the point is that when a lot of businesses had asked their employees to sort of do the right thing, if you like, and try to get them to understand the impact that coming out would have on their business and potentially their jobs, it didn't go down very well. And so immediately after the referendum, there was a lot of, if you like, licking of wounds and just thinking, hang on a minute, we've got to think about this communication. And the fact that there was all the political stuff, you know, people are more involved, what have you, but there was the realization that there was a bigger chunk of the population that was disaffected than not, and so on and so on and so forth. So business had to really think carefully then about how he communicated with his workforce. And for a time, it was, hang on, look, you're the politicians, they voted out, look, you sort this out, and we'll just have to follow a little bit. But more recently, I have to say, there's been a lot more activity. You may not see it in the press all the time, you may not see it around, but there is a lot of, well, probably the best example, I was talking to a chap earlier about it, it was Greg Clark on the Andrew Marr show, when he was talking about some specifics, a little bit like today, he was talking about specific reasons why it was going to have an effect on jobs, an effect on automotive, aerospace, manufacturing. And that really hit home because it created a bit of a political furore, because there was a lot of people in the Conservative Party said it was Project Fear again, and really it's not. It's trying to state the facts, and there's a bit more of that now coming through in the discussions in the background. But I would hope you'd see more of it now in the next few months, because we really need to have. I mean, the customs bill is going through Parliament at the moment, so if you keep an eye on that, that could have a profound effect. I won't tell you that I've got £10 on the general election this year, so I'll move on.
Well, thank you very much. Please, Daniel.
Thanks for a really fascinating session. I enjoyed it tremendously. A theme that's come up on several occasions in this panel and on a previous panel, it was sort of the note on which you ended, really, is about devolution as part of the solution to problems that are either caused by or unveiled by Brexit. One of the things I do is public attitudes work. And one of the most striking findings that I've seen in over quite a period of time, but it's not getting any better, is that people across the UK, people in England, across England, are very skeptical about Westminster. If you ask people questions, you know, do politicians at Westminster care about people like me? Or do politicians at Westminster care about the place where I live? You get maybe 1 in 5 at a maximum saying that they do, and it's usually around 1 in 10. And that's true of people who voted Leave at least as much as it's true of people who voted Remain. Indeed, it's probably the other way round. So if Leavers don't like Brussels and the EU, it's not clear that taking back control for them means returning lawmaking to a Westminster that they don't trust. Having said that, the processes of devolution in the UK, going back actually to the 1920s, when you had a form of devolution in Northern Ireland when partition happened, but certainly including the devolution processes to Scotland and Wales, have been, the polite word that's always used is asymmetrical. In other words, there are different solutions for the different non-English parts of the UK. And I live and work in Wales, where the period since devolution has essentially been one long dysfunctional argument about the constitutional arrangements, because the initial model of devolution was a sort of local government writ large model, and it's been changed repeatedly since then, and that change is ongoing and was happening immediately before Brexit and is continuing after Brexit. If you look at what devolution means in England, again, it means different things in different places on different scales. It seems to me that over the last number of years, we've seen education policies become taken out of local areas and more centralized, and devolution seems to focus on transport, which makes some kind of sense, but also then giving more local autonomy to, say, the NHS, which has been a more centralized policy. If I was thinking about local economic development, I would pick local control of education over local control of health. And so I worry that there's a, you know, if devolution is the solution, we're getting an asymmetrical, confused, opaque form of devolution, which may actually damage the credibility of devolution as a solution to the kinds of issues and problems that we've been discussing today. It's more a statement, but I guess I'm asking you to reflect on that.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. What we've seen in terms of devolution under the coalition government and more recently is very much a dog's breakfast, I think, in terms of the creation of local enterprise partnerships, the people involved in them, very good meaning, done a lot of good work, but locally we've got LEPs which do not reflect functional economic geography. They weren't about the economics, they were whatever political deals could be stitched up locally. So it was a bottom-up process which was very, very chaotic. The creation of a combined authority goes some way to try and rectify that and get a critical scale back into some sort of regional scale locally, which makes a lot more sense in terms of doing economic policy. But you're absolutely right. And I think one of the outcomes of Phil's book that looked at these sort of big regional inequalities in the UK is that we have forms of devolution which are small scale, fragmented, often the sort of poorest form of decentralization we can think of in terms of the big challenges that we face in terms of inequalities across the country. Increasingly, I've become much more radical in my views on this, and I think the only way we're going to start to tackle some of these things is a proper federal system, where we, on a proper regional scale of big enough scope to do industrial policy, we devolve taxation, finance, whole areas of decision-making down to a regional scale in order to try and tackle some of these problems. And you're right as well, in the sense we've seen a fragmented and patchwork form of devolution. After what we've seen, we still have, by a very, very long way, the most centralised state in Western Europe. So, it's just tinkering at the edges, really, and the forms of devolution we've seen, they're not going to be game changers.
Do you want me to say something, or do you want to move on?
No, you can say something.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm not a political scientist. I come at this from the perspective of working with the combined authority being the deputy chair of the Productivity and Skills Commission locally, okay, where we are trying to figure out, not surprisingly, how we're going to improve productivity and skills. Okay, so there's an awful lot of thinking around different sectors. One of the sector leads was here before, and so you take an issue like, how are we going to support a particular supply chain? The firms know where the blockages are, and as often as not, those blockages come down to skills. And then skills, so that we know locally what the issues are, and then the skills policy is a vertical thing that resides in Westminster that says we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And that X, Y, and Z doesn't then map onto all the other evidence locally. And so it's not that I'm not interested in the political outcomes of this, but that is how I see devolution having to work. It has the key policies that can drive Dave's industrial strategy have to occur locally. Now, how far we go with that in terms of tax-raising powers and whatever, I leave to people who are more interested in political science than me, but I'm looking at it from if you like, from a productivity and skills perspective.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have to stop here, because we go to the policy debate session. If there are questions, they can be asked later, and if the presenters are sitting in the audience, they feel free to answer the questions. Well, thank you very much for all the panelists. Has been great, this session, and let's move to the next one.